The chandelier above the heavy mahogany table flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the faces of the family. Louis didn't just speak, he performed. He leaned forward, his polished silk tie dipping into the edge of his wineglass, and leveled a trembling finger directly at Paula's face. "Look at you," he sneered, his voice cutting through the clinking of silverware like a serrated blade. "You sit there in that thrift store rag, staring at your plate like a beaten dog. Do you have any idea how much of an embarrassment you are to this family, to my father's legacy?" Paula kept her gaze fixed on a small chip in the porcelain of her dinner plate. She could feel the heat of the background woman's smirk from across the table. Jessica, the woman who had been whispering in Louis's ear for months. Louis's father, the patriarch, sat at the head of the table, his eyes cold and disapproving, offering no shield for the woman who had been his daughter-in-law for 5 years. "You're a weight, Paula," Louis continued, emboldened by the cruel silence of the room. "A plain, poor pig. You should be down on your knees thanking me that I haven't replaced you with someone who actually understands what it means to carry the name of a billion-dollar firm." A suffocating wave of shame washed over Paula, but beneath the surface of her tense posture, something else was stirring. Her hand moved instinctively toward the modest handbag resting on her lap. Inside, tucked into a side pocket, was her phone. Just 20 minutes ago, while pretending to check a recipe in the kitchen, she had received the final notification. The file was labeled with the clinical, unassuming name Asset 44B. It was the acquisition of a debt-ridden, hemorrhaging manufacturing firm, Louis's father's life work. To the world, the buyer was an anonymous offshore conglomerate under the Hale umbrella. In reality, it was Paula. "I asked you a question," Louis barked, slamming his palm onto the table. "Do you even understand the pressure I'm under to save this company while you spend your days doing nothing?" Paula finally looked up. Her eyes weren't wet with the tears he expected. They were as clear and still as a frozen lake. She saw Louis as he truly was, a man shouting in a house he no longer owned, wearing a suit bought with credit he couldn't repay, insulting the very woman who had just signed the check to keep his father out of prison. "I understand more than you think, Louis," she said, her voice a soft, terrifying whisper that silenced his next insult. She felt the weight of the billion-dollar secret resting against her thigh. The papers were signed. The funds were wired. The trap was set. Louis thought he was the hunter, but as he stood there red-faced and arrogant, Paula realized he was nothing more than a ghost in a boardroom she now controlled. She would let him finish his dinner. It was, after all, the last meal he would ever have on her dime. The morning after the dinner felt like waking up in a house built of glass. Paula sat in the small, sunlit, dappled kitchen of her modest home, a space Louis rarely visited, claiming it smelled of mediocrity. To him, this 2-bedroom cottage was a mark of her lack of ambition, but to Paula, it was a sanctuary of memory. Here, the floorboards creaked with the rhythm of her mother's footsteps, and the walls held the scent of dried lavender and old books. She traced the edge of a worn wooden table, her fingers lingering over a deep scratch in the grain. Her mother, Olivia Hale, had been a woman of immense, quiet power, a billionaire who moved through the world like a shadow, believing that true influence didn't need to shout to be felt. "A heart is a fortress, Paula," her mother had told her weeks before she passed. "Build it strong, but keep the gates hidden. Let them see only the garden, never the gold in the cellar." Paula had taken those words too literally, perhaps. She had hidden herself so well that she had allowed Louis to believe she was small. She looked at the framed photograph on the mantel, Olivia standing on a balcony in Milan, looking regal yet unassuming. Her mother had built the Hale empire not with aggression, but with foresight. She had seen the collapses before they happened. She had bought the competitors before they knew they were losing. The memory of her mother's strength surged through Paula, a stark contrast to the way Louis had looked at her the night before. He saw a poor fat pig, but in the reflection of the darkened kitchen window, Paula saw her mother's eyes, sharp, calculating, and immovable. She realized then that her quiet endurance wasn't a sign of weakness, but a legacy of patience. She opened her laptop, the glow illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The screen flickered to life, displaying the complex web of the Hale holdings. The modest home around her, with its mismatched chairs and fading wallpaper, was just the garden. Luis had spent years mocking the garden, never realizing that the woman he called Nothing held the keys to every gate in his world. As she checked the morning's stock opening, the melancholic weight of the previous night began to harden into something colder, something clinical. She wasn't just Olivia's daughter anymore, she was the successor, and the successor was about to close the gates. While Paula sat in the quiet sanctuary of her cottage, a frantic, suffocating heat gripped the executive suite of Carter Industries. Luis paced the length of his father's office, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the Persian rug. The bravado he had displayed at dinner was gone, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. On the desk lay a stack of red-stamped notices, liquidity warnings, loan defaults, and the terrifying finality of a foreclosure notice. "We have 48 hours, Luis," his father, Richard, rasped. The older man looked as though he had aged a decade overnight. His hands, usually steady as he commanded the family legacy, were trembling as they clutched a glass of amber liquid. "The bank has stopped answering my calls. The suppliers are holding our shipments at the docks. If this mystery buyer doesn't close the deal by Friday, we aren't just losing the company, we're losing the house, the cars, everything." Luis stopped his pacing, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city skyline he had always assumed would belong to him. "It's that anonymous conglomerate, isn't it? The one under the Hale umbrella." He spat the name as if it were a curse. "Why are they dragging their feet? They know we're desperate. They're bleeding us dry just to lower the price." "They aren't lowering the price," Richard countered, his voice cracking. "They've met every demand, but they've gone silent. It's as if they're waiting for something, for us to hit rock bottom." Luis felt a surge of unearned indignation. He thought of Paula, sitting at home, probably tending to her pathetic little garden, unaware that his world was imploding. He felt a twisted urge to go home and lash out at her again, just to feel powerful for a moment, to feel like he was still a king somewhere. "I'll call the brokers again," Luis snapped, grabbing his jacket. "I'll tell them we'll sign whatever they want, we just need the cash injection today." "You'll tell them nothing," Richard growled, finally looking up with a gaze of pure desperation. "We are beggars now, Luis. We don't dictate terms. We wait for the Hale heir to decide if we're worth saving or if they'd rather watch us burn." Luis didn't respond. He couldn't. The realization was beginning to sink in. The legacy he had used to belittle his wife was nothing more than a hollow shell. He was a man standing on a trapdoor shouting at the clouds, while the silent hand of a billionaire he had never met held the lever. He adjusted his tie, trying to maintain the illusion of a businessman, but the sweat on his brow told the truth. He was terrified, and for the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. The afternoon sun filtered through the high, arched windows of the Hale legal headquarters, a fortress of glass and steel that sat miles away from the chaos of Luis's crumbling world. Paula sat at the head of a conference table that felt vast enough to hold a dozen secrets. Before her lay a single, elegant leather folder containing the acquisition papers for a venture her advisors had termed a strategic mercy buy. Her lead counsel, a man who had served her mother for 30 years, slid a gold pen toward her. "The target is officially identified as Asset 44B, Paula. As we discussed, it's a manufacturing firm on the brink of total liquidation. The owners are desperate, the debt is astronomical, but the infrastructure fits perfectly into our logistical expansion." Paula looked down at the documents. She didn't see the name of the company. It had been redacted and replaced with the corporate code to ensure her anonymity remained absolute until the final filing. She only saw the numbers, the bleeding accounts, the unpaid pensions, and the sheer incompetence of the current management. It reminded her of the very thing her mother hated: arrogance without the talent to back it up. "Will this save the employees' jobs?" Paula asked, her voice steady. "Every single one," the lawyer replied, "but the current executive board will be stripped of all authority. They've bled this company dry. They deserve to walk away with nothing." Paula thought of the thousands of families whose livelihoods depended on this signature. She didn't care about the profit, she cared about the protection. She thought of her mother's legacy, of being the silent safety net for those who worked hard while their leaders played at being kings. With a fluid, practiced motion, she signed her name, Paula Hale. She had no idea that the ink was still drying on a document that effectively owned the roof over Luis's head. She didn't know that the desperate owners her lawyer spoke of with such disdain were the same men who had mocked her dress and her dignity less than 24 hours ago. In her mind, she was simply doing what a Hale was born to do, taking control of the chaos. As she closed the folder, a strange sense of peace settled over her. The transaction was complete. The asset was hers. She stood up, smoothing her simple skirt, unaware that she had just bought the very throne Luis used to look down on her. The trap hadn't been set by malice, but by destiny, and the irony was about to become the sharpest weapon she had ever held. The following morning, Paula decided to do something she hadn't done in months. She walked into the city's business district to clear her head before the final acquisition meeting. The air was crisp, but the peace she had felt in her cottage was short-lived. As she passed a high-end French cafe, a flash of a familiar tailored charcoal suit caught her eye through the window. It was Luis. He wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was Jessica, the woman from the dinner table, the one who had watched his cruelty with such rapt, silent approval. They were huddled close over marble-topped tables, their laughter light and intimate, a sound Paula hadn't heard from Luis in years. Stepping into the cafe's vestibule to avoid being seen, Paula felt the heavy glass door swing shut behind a departing patron. In that moment, the air shifted. A thick, cloying cloud of expensive, spicy jasmine perfume hit her, the exact same scent she had noticed lingering on Luis's jacket for weeks, the scent she had tried to convince herself was just a remnant of a busy office. Up close, there was no denying it. It was the scent of a secret life. She watched as Luis reached across the table, his hand covering Jessica's. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice carrying just enough to reach Paula's ears. "The deal with the Hale Group is almost done. Once the cash hits, I'm done with the pig. I'll finally have the resources to give you the life you deserve. Just a few more days of playing the part." Jessica giggled, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "You're so cruel to her, Luis. It's almost impressive." "It's not cruelty if it's the truth," Luis replied, with a shrug, his face twisted into the same arrogant mask he had worn at dinner. Paula stood frozen, the gold pen in her purse, the one she had used to save his father's legacy, suddenly feeling like a hot brand against her side. The part he was playing was her husband, and the resources he was planning to spend on his mistress were hers. He wasn't just a man struggling with a failing business. He was a predator waiting to feast on the carcass of a woman he thought was weak. She turned and walked out of the cafe, her heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat of realization. The melancholy was gone, stripped away by the sharp, stinging scent of jasmine. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a judge. As she hailed a taxi to her lawyer's office, she realized her mother was right. The gates were hidden for a reason, and now she was going to lock Luis outside of them forever. The dining room was a theater of cold expectations, the air thick with the smell of roasted lamb and the suffocating weight of the Carter family's arrogance. Luis sat at the center of it all, his face flushed with the wine he had been drinking and the secret confidence he had stolen from his meeting with Jessica. He looked at Paula, who sat quietly at the edge of the table, her posture slightly hunched as if trying to occupy as little space as possible. The conversation had turned, as it always did, to the impending collapse of the family firm. Richard, Luis's father, looked gray and defeated, his eyes fixed on the empty space between the candlesticks. "We need a miracle," Richard murmured, his voice barely audible. If the Hale Group doesn't finalize the merger by tomorrow morning, we are finished." Luis let out a sharp, jagged laugh that made the silverware rattle. "A miracle? We don't need a miracle, Father. We need people with actual value." He turned his head slowly toward Paula, his eyes narrowing with the cruelty that had been sharpened by the morning's betrayal. "Unlike my wife here, who contributes nothing but an extra seat at a table she doesn't deserve." Paula felt the eyes of the room shift toward her, her hands kept under the table, her thumb tracing the screen of her purse, where a new notification from her lawyer glowed in the dark of her purse. "Please, Luis," Paula said softly, her voice a fragile thread in the heavy room. "Not here." "Why not here?" Luis barked, his voice rising to a shout. He stood up, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor like a dying animal. He pointed a finger at her, his face contorted with a mixture of entitlement and disgust. "Look at you. You sit there in your cheap clothes, hiding your body because you're ashamed. You're just a poor, fat pig, Paula. You're a drain on my resources and an anchor on my life. You should be down on your knees thanking this family for every scrap of bread we put on your plate." A heavy, ringing silence followed his words. No one defended her. Richard didn't look up. His mother simply sipped her wine, her expression as blank as a stone wall. Jessica, seated at the far end, didn't even hide her satisfied smile. Paula didn't cry. The sting of the words was there, but it was being rapidly overtaken by a cold, crystalline clarity. She looked at the man she had once promised to love, a man who thought he was a giant while he was currently begging for her money. "You're right, Luis," she said, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. She stood up slowly, her spine straightening with a grace they hadn't seen in years. "I don't belong at this table." As she walked away, the cloying scent of Jessica's jasmine perfume seemed to follow her, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a signal. She reached into her bag and tapped a single command on her phone. Asset 44B. Accelerate reveal to 0800 tomorrow. The dinner was over, and so was the lie. He had called her a pig, but tomorrow he would find out she was the owner of the pen. The silence of the cottage was a stark contrast to the venomous echoes of the dinner party. Paula stood in her small bedroom, the moonlight cutting a silver path across the floor. She had lived in this space for years, playing the role of the devoted, modest wife, but tonight the walls felt too tight. She reached for Luis's briefcase, which he had carelessly left behind in his haste to join his father for a late-night strategy session. Her hands didn't shake this time. She clicked the latches open, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside, hidden behind a flap of leather, she found a folder that wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't corporate debt or bank notices. It was a collection of printed emails and travel itineraries, weekend getaways to resorts in Aspen, and jewelry receipts for pieces she had never seen. The most recent receipt was for a diamond tennis bracelet, purchased on the same day Louisa told her they were too broke to fix the heating in their home. The name on the shipping address wasn't hers. It was Jessica's. A cold, clinical calm washed over her. She realized then that Luis wasn't just a man struggling with a failing legacy. He was a thief of her time, her kindness, and her heart. He had been using the very scraps he mocked her for to fund a life of luxury with another woman, all while waiting for the Hale Group, waiting for her to save him from his own incompetence. Paula walked to her desk and opened her laptop. The interface for the Hale Holdings portal was sleek and intimidating, a digital throne she had inherited but rarely sat upon. She navigated to the Asset 44B dashboard. The scheduled closing date was set for the following week, a grace period she had originally granted to give the Carters time to settle their affairs. She highlighted the date, her finger hovered over the trackpad. She thought of the jasmine perfume, the laughter in the cafe, and the poor fat pig insult that still hung in the air of the dining room. "You wanted a miracle, Luis," she whispered to the empty room, "but miracles can also be judgments." With a firm click, she moved the acquisition date to the following morning at 8 a.m. Then she sent a single encrypted message to her lead counsel. "Full disclosure, I will be attending the boardroom meeting in person. Prepare the termination papers for the entire executive tier. No severance, no exceptions." She closed the laptop and looked out the window. The sun would be rising soon, and for the first time in her marriage, Paula Hale wasn't afraid of the light. She was the one bringing the storm. The morning air in the city was sharp and clinical, mirroring the transformation that had taken place behind the closed doors of the cottage. At 7:59 a.m., the elevator in the Carter Industries headquarters chimed, opening to reveal a woman the lobby guards didn't recognize. Gone was the slouching, apologetic figure from the dinner table. Paula stood tall in a tailored navy blue suit that cinched at her waist, her hair pulled back into a sharp, uncompromising knot. Her eyes, once downcast, were now as cold and focused as a winter sunrise. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with the stench of desperation and stale coffee. Luis and his father were hunched over the mahogany table, whispering frantically about the 11th hour savior who was supposed to sign the final documents. "Where are they?" Richard barked at the secretary. "The Hale Group representative was supposed to be here 5 minutes ago." "They're already here." A voice calm and resonant drifted from the doorway. Luis didn't even look up at first. "Not now, Paula. I told you I'm in the middle of saving this family. Get back to the car before you embarrass me in front of—" His voice died in his throat as Paula walked to the head of the table. She didn't stop until she reached the chair typically reserved for the chairman. The board members, men who had ignored her presence for years, sat frozen as she placed a heavy, leather-bound portfolio on the table. "Sit down, Luis," she said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a gavel. "What is this joke?" Luis laughed, though the sound was brittle and thin. "Did you follow me here to beg for an apology? Guards, get her out of here." "The guards answer to the owner of this building," Paula replied, sliding a single document across the table toward Richard. "And as of 8 a.m., that owner is me." Richard's face went from pale to ghostly white as his eyes scanned the signature on the bottom of the acquisition deed. It wasn't the anonymous conglomerate name they had expected. It was a name that carried more weight than the Carters could ever dream of. Paula Hale, sole heir to the Hale estate. The room descended into a vacuum of silence. Luis reached for the paper, his hands trembling so violently he nearly tore it. He looked from the document to his wife, the woman he had called a poor fat pig only hours ago, and for the first time he saw the predator behind the prey. Paula didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with the detached curiosity of someone observing a broken machine. The silent victim was gone. In her place sat the woman who now owned every debt, every secret, and every future the Carters had left. Paula leaned back in the chair, her expression a mask of quiet steel. "The meeting is now in session," she said, "and the first item on the agenda is your immediate removal." Richard's mouth hung open, a silent gasp of a man who had just realized the life raft he was reaching for was actually a shark. Luis, however, was still trapped in his own delusions. He lunged toward the head of the table, his face a contorted mask of red-veined fury. "This is fraud!" Luis screamed, his voice cracking. "You stole this! You used our family's information to—" "I used my own capital to save a sinking ship that you and your father sabotaged with greed and incompetence," Paula interrupted, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a cold authority that froze the room. She didn't look at him, she looked through him. She pulled a stack of folders from her briefcase, not the blue ones containing the merger, but crimson ones labeled Internal Audit. "Section 4, Luis," she said, sliding the first folder toward Richard. "It details 3 years of systematic embezzlement, company funds used for consulting fees that were actually payments for a luxury apartment in the city. And Section 5, she paused, her eyes finally meeting Luis's with a look of profound pity. "The travel expenses for your business trips to Aspen with Jessica Warren." Richard's hands shook as he opened the folder. His eyes darted over the photographs of Luis and Jessica at the cafe, the jewelry receipts, and the flight manifests. The old man looked at his son, his expression shifting from shock to a soul-crushing realization. You used the last of our liquidity to buy diamonds for a mistress when I was begging the banks for mercy? He did, Paula said, her tone clinical. And because he did, the Hale Group is exercising the moral turpitude clause in the acquisition contract. Richard, you are being removed for gross negligence. Luis, you are being terminated for cause, effective immediately. Your access to the building has already been revoked, and your personal accounts, which were tied to company credit, are frozen pending a criminal investigation. You can't do this, Luis pleaded, the bravado finally breaking. He reached out to touch her arm, but Paula recoiled as if his very presence was a contagion. I already have, she said. She signaled to the 2 security guards standing by the door. Please escort the former executives out of my building. They are no longer permitted on the premises. The family that had mocked her for being a poor, fat pig now looked like small, scavenging animals caught in a floodlight. As the guards gripped Louis's arms, he began to sob, a loud, hollow sound that filled the boardroom. Paula didn't watch them go. She simply opened her laptop, the glow reflecting in her steady eyes, and began the work of rebuilding what they had tried to destroy. The placeholder wife had left the room. The CEO had taken her seat. The aftermath of the boardroom collapse was not a sudden explosion, but a cold, steady erosion of everything Louis had ever valued. 2 weeks later, he sat in the center of a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, the air smelling of stale takeout and damp cardboard. The sprawling estate, the custom-tailored suits, and the fleet of cars had been stripped away like dead skin. Because the acquisition had been a total buyout of debt and assets, even the family's personal holdings had been liquidated to cover the years of hidden embezzlement Paula's auditors had unearthed. Louis stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over Jessica's name. He'd called her 30 times. When she finally answered, her voice was a stranger's, brittle and devoid of the warmth he had paid for with stolen diamonds. Don't call me again, Louis, she had said, the background noise of a busy airport humming behind her. I don't date former executives. I date winners, and right now, you're just a liability with a pending court date. The line had gone dead, leaving him in a silence so profound it felt heavy. He looked at the legal notice on his coffee table, a final divorce decree and a restraining order from the Hale estate. He was alone, left with nothing but the echoes of his own cruelty. He realized now that he hadn't just lost a company, he had lost the only person who had ever truly looked at him with kindness. Miles away, the atmosphere was entirely different. The top floor of the Hale Global Tower was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Paula stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. She was no longer hiding under layers of fabric or downcast eyes. She wore a simple, elegant dress that did not seek to conceal her form, standing with a posture that was relaxed yet immovable. Her assistant entered quietly, placing a folder on the desk. The restructuring of the manufacturing plant is complete, Miss Hale. The workers' pensions have been restored, and the new management team is ready for your briefing. Paula nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. She didn't feel the need for revenge. The weight of the billion-dollar secret was no longer a burden, but a tool. She'd reclaimed her mother's legacy and in the process found her own voice. As she turned back to her desk to sign the final papers for the new year, she caught her reflection in the glass. She didn't see the poor fat pig Louis had tried to convince her she was. She saw a woman of quiet steel, a billionaire who had survived the fire and emerged as the architect of her own future. The gates were finally open, and for the first time in her life, Paula Hale was exactly where she was meant to be.